Spring 1945. The Third Reich is collapsing. Allied soldiers believe the war is practically over. But on the banks of the Main River, one picturesque Bavarian town refuses to die quietly. In this video, we uncover the Siege of Aschaffenburg, a fanatical last stand that forced General George Patton to unleash a brutal masterpiece of urban warfare. But Patton didn't just destroy this city to win a battle. He destroyed it to send a terrifying message to the rest of Germany, a message that would ultimately save tens of thousands of lives.
Aber mein Freund, ich hab die anderen genauso vernichtet. Sie
Couldn't keep my mind on my work, really. But it was very thrilling.
By late March 1945, the European theatre of World War II felt like a clock winding down to its final, inevitable tick. The Western Allies had achieved the impossible. They had crossed the mighty Rhine River. The natural barrier that had protected the German heartland for centuries had been breached. For the American GI pushing eastward, the mood was shifting. The bitter, freezing nightmare of the Battle of the Bulge was behind them. The spring sun was finally beginning to thaw the mud of Europe. Across the lines, German units were surrendering by the tens of thousands. Entire divisions were throwing down their weapons, eager to be captured by the Americans rather than face the wrath of the advancing Soviet Red Army in the east. For the men of the United States Third Army, commanded by the legendary General George S. Patton, the orders were simple: keep moving. Patton's doctrine was built on speed, aggression, and relentless forward momentum. He despised static warfare. He wanted his tanks rolling and his infantry marching until the Nazi regime was nothing but a memory. In the path of this unstoppable American juggernaut lay Aschaffenburg. Nestled on the banks of the Main River, Aschaffenburg was a jewel of Bavaria. With its mild climate, stunning architecture, and the magnificent, towering Schloss Johannisberg overlooking the water, it was historically known as the Bavarian Nice. It was a place of culture, of wine, of peaceful river breezes. When the battle-hardened veterans of the US 45th Infantry Division, the famous Thunderbirds, approached the city limits on March 28th, they expected a formality. They expected white sheets hanging from the windows. They expected a mayor offering the keys to the city. Instead, they were met with a storm of machine gun fire, mortar shells, and anti-tank rockets. The war was not over. In Aschaffenburg, it was just about to reach its most terrifying climax. To understand why Aschaffenburg chose to fight when the rest of Germany was folding, you have to understand the mind of the men who commanded its defense. Major Emil Lamberth. As the Allies advanced, Adolf Hitler became increasingly delusional, issuing the infamous Festung or fortress orders. He designated specific cities as fortresses, commanding that they be defended to the last man, the last bullet, and the last drop of blood. Retreat was punishable by death. Surrender was treason. Most German commanders quietly ignored these orders, choosing to spare their cities from annihilation. Major Lambert was not most commanders. Historical records reveal a chilling detail. Lambert wasn't some high-ranking SS mastermind. He was a former schoolteacher and a World War I veteran. But with fanatic SS officials breathing down his neck, this seemingly ordinary man chose to become a monster. He became a fanatic, a true believer in the dying cult of the Third Reich. And he intended to turn Aschaffenburg into a graveyard for the Americans. Lambert's first act was to wage war on his own people. He knew that the regular Wehrmacht soldiers and the local civilians had no desire to die for a lost cause. So, he instituted a reign of psychological terror. He deployed flying court-martials, roving squads of loyalists who hunted down anyone suspected of defeatism. If a German soldier attempted to surrender, he was shot. If a civilian suggested raising a white flag, they were dragged into the street. Lambert ordered the execution of his own men, hanging their bodies from the lampposts of Aschaffenburg's beautiful streets. Around their necks, he hung crude cardboard signs that read, "I am a coward who refused to defend his country." It was a gruesome, visceral warning. The citizens of Aschaffenburg were trapped. If they fought the Americans, they would likely die. If they refused to fight, Lambert's executioners would guarantee it. Lambert scraped together a nightmare army. He had a corps of hardened Wehrmacht veterans. But the bulk of his forces were a tragic mix of the desperate and the doomed. He conscripted the Volkssturm, old men in their 60s and 70s. He emptied the local military hospitals, forcing convalescing, wounded soldiers back to the front lines. And most tragically, he armed the Hitler Youth. Brainwashed teenagers, some as young as 14, handed Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and told to hunt American Shermans. Aschaffenburg was no longer a city. It was a booby-trapped, fortified meat grinder. And the Americans were walking right into it. When the 157th Infantry Regiment of the 45th Division pushed into the outer suburbs of Aschaffenburg, the trap was sprung. American-led elements were instantly pinned down by interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Snipers fired from church steeples. Hitler Youth ambushed tanks from basement windows, firing rockets into the thin side armor of American vehicles before disappearing into the rubble. The 157th was a veteran outfit. They had bled on the beaches of Sicily, fought through the mountains of Italy, and survived the hell of Anzio. But this was different. This was urban warfare in its purest, most chaotic form. It was what the Germans called Rattenkrieg, rat war. Every street corner was a fatal funnel. Every doorway could be rigged with explosives. If an American squad tried to cross a street, they were cut down by MG-42 fire. If they tried to clear a house through the front door, they were met with a hail of submachine gun fire from the staircase. The Americans quickly realized that traditional infantry tactics would result in a bloodbath. They were losing men rapidly in a war that was supposed to be over. The frustration among the American ranks was palpable. Why were they dying for this piece of ground? Why wouldn't the Germans just quit? Word of the fierce resistance reached General George S. Patton, and Patton, never one to tolerate a delay, decided it was time to change the math of the battlefield. Patton's philosophy of war was famous. Hold them by the nose and kick them in the ass. He believed in mobility, flanking maneuvers, and outpacing the enemy. But you cannot flank a city block. You cannot outmaneuver a sniper hiding in a basement. Faced with a fanatical enemy entrenched in an urban fortress, Patton and the commanders of the 45th Division formulated a new strategy. If the Germans wanted to use the city of Aschaffenburg as a weapon, the Americans would simply erase the city. This is where the Siege of Aschaffenburg transforms into a brutal masterpiece of military tactics. It was a cold, calculated decision. Patton decided to trade masonry for American lives. He would use overwhelming, terrifying firepower to systematically dismantle the city, block by block. The Americans stopped trying to take streets with infantry alone. Instead, they brought up the big guns. 155mm long Tom artillery pieces, weapons designed to fire shells at targets miles away, were rolled directly into the streets of Aschaffenburg. They were used in a direct fire role, essentially as massive, point-blank shotguns. When American infantry took fire from a building, they didn't rush the door. They fell back, called up a 155mm gun, and fired a 95-pound high-explosive shell directly through the front window. The building would simply cease to exist. To avoid the deadly streets entirely, the American infantry employed a tactic known as mouse-holing. Instead of walking out the front door of a cleared house to get to the next one, combat engineers would place explosive charges on the interior walls. They would blow a hole straight through the masonry into the adjacent building, throwing in fragmentation grenades, and storm through the dust and smoke. They moved from house to house, block to block, without ever stepping foot on the pavement. They fought through living rooms, kitchens, and bedrooms, turning suburban homes into battlefields. And from the sky, Patton unleashed hell. He called in P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers. The sky above Aschaffenburg roared with the sound of radial engines as American pilots dropped 500-pound bombs and napalm directly onto German strongpoints. The city burned. The Bavarian Nice was reduced to a blackened, smoking crater. The sky was choked with ash and pulverized brick. But still, Major Lambert refused to surrender. By April 2nd, the fight had raged for nearly a week. The American vice was tightening around the city center. The heart of the German defense was the magnificent Schloss Johannisberg, the massive Renaissance palace that dominated the skyline. The castle, once a symbol of German culture, was now a fortress of desperation. German troops fired from the ornate windows. American tanks rolled up to the courtyard and blasted the ancient stone walls at point-blank range. The roof caught fire, sending a massive plume of black smoke into the spring sky. Down in the cellars beneath the burning city, the civilian population was living a nightmare. Thousands of women, children, and elderly citizens huddled in the dark, listening to the earth-shattering concussions of American artillery and the terrifying roar of collapsing buildings. They had no food, no clean water, and no hope. Finally, the fanaticism began to crack. The teenage boys of the Hitler Youth, who had fought with such terrifying zeal days earlier, were now weeping in the rubble, calling for their mothers. The old men of the Volkssturm were throwing away their rifles. Even Lambert's hardened Wehrmacht veterans realized that they were fighting for a ghost. The Third Reich was dead. It just hadn't stopped breathing yet. On the morning of April 3rd, 1945, the reality of the situation finally pierced the delusion of Major Emil Lamberth. His fortress was gone. His army was decimated. There was nowhere left to retreat, and no walls left to hide behind. At 9 a.m., a white flag emerged from the ruins. Major Lambert walked out of his bunker to surrender. In a stark, almost sickening contrast to the apocalyptic destruction around him, Lambert emerged wearing a crisp, immaculately clean dress uniform, complete with his medals. He surrendered to the dust-covered, bloodied, and exhausted American GIs who had just spent a week fighting through the hell he had created. The Siege of Aschaffenburg was over. When the smoke finally cleared, the true cost of the siege was revealed. The beautiful city of Aschaffenburg was virtually erased from the map. Over 80% of the city lay in absolute ruin. Thousands of German soldiers and civilians were dead or wounded. The Americans had captured over 3,500 prisoners. But the victory had come at a steep price for the US 45th Infantry Division. They had suffered hundreds of casualties. Men who had survived years of brutal combat across Europe, only to be killed in the final weeks of the war for a city that had no strategic value to the dying Nazi empire. But Patton didn't just leave Aschaffenburg in ashes and walk away. He used the city's corpse as a weapon. The US military realized that Aschaffenburg was the perfect, horrifying example. They took photographs of the pulverized medieval architecture. They documented the bodies of the German soldiers that Lambert had hanged from the lampposts, and they turned them into a massive psychological operation. As Patton's Third Army continued its march across Germany, they dropped leaflets and broadcast messages to other holdout cities. The message was brutally simple. It was a terrifying ultimatum, but it worked. In the final weeks of the war, dozens of German mayors and commanders looked at the fate of the Bavarian Nice and quietly chose to ignore Berlin. They raised the white flags. They surrendered their towns without firing a single shot. By completely erasing one city, Patton and the American military broke the illusion of the Nazi fortress, saving countless American and German lives in the process. The Siege of Aschaffenburg was a tragedy of fanaticism, but it became the brutal masterpiece that helped finally break the back of the Third Reich. While fanatic commanders like Lambert surrendered when the walls finally closed in, the men at the very top of the Third Reich faced a much darker fate. Click the video on your screen to uncover the bizarre and brutal deaths of every major Nazi leader.